It's an interesting when you read it or sing it, the Lord's Prayer that he had. How many of us really want him to forgive us like we forgive others? That's what it said, doesn't it? It also said, is his will done in heaven? Okay, but he gives us a free choice on earth. And how many of us are willing to follow his will on earth that he wants us to be doing? That's what we're asking for. We're asking, saying, hey, we want, just like it's in heaven, we want to follow your will. And that can be changes in all of our lives. And I think it's important for all of us to be thinking about it. So just be thinking about it this week on that. If you remember, we've been going through the book of 1 Corinthians. We had given it the title of Practical Christianity, and last week Glenn filled in and did part 5, which was in chapter 3, which is the spiritual growth part of it. And so I want to just kind of review a couple of things that he talked about. And if you remember in chapter 3, the first part would be that of roles. If you remember, they're judging. There are a lot of divisions in the church of Corinth, much like in our country. And the first part was roles, and he said you need to realize that the role that they had was that of being servants. And I want you to look in verse 5 for a second, because it's interesting, because I think this is where we get a lot of things messed up when we look at it. Notice in verse 5 of chapter 3, it said, what then is Apollos, what is Paul? Notice he uses the word what, he doesn't say who. And I think that is critical, because most of the time we are following people and individuals and ministers or whatever, not who they are, but what they are. And he wants us to make sure, hey, so notice he says, then what are we? We're servants. It's not our how we come across, or our great orator, or knowledge of whatever. It's what are we? We are all servants. And so I think it's interesting. Notice also on the role part, if you remember, it was that of areas. One plants and one waters. Well, okay, if that's the case, Paul planted, Apollos watered, where would when people would see growth, which one would they probably see it in? The one who planted or the one who's doing the watering? Well, if you plant, it's going to be underground for the most part. How much growth are you going to see? But all of a sudden it's coming above. So you got to realize, even when we're comparing and looking at each other, we all have different parts, and some are going to be a lot, you can see it. I think one of the best examples of this, you remember in John chapter 4, when the Samaritan woman, Christ leads the Samaritan woman to Christ, and then she goes back into the city, and remember they're coming back out in John 4, and Jesus said, behold, you say there's 4 months into the harvest, talking about the literal harvest, and he says, I tell you the harvest is right here. And then remember, what does he say? Reap where you did not sow, therefore that you all can basically gather and be rewarded as a result. Who did the sowing? The apostles didn't sow. Who did the sowing? The prophets of the Old Testament, Jesus and the Samaritan woman. The prophets, you mean Isaiah, who'd been dead for that many years? So that's why when we get to heaven, there are going to be rewards of all kinds of things that took place, takes place and goes down. God is keeping track of all of it. Each one of us has a part. So that was that. Notice also said God caused the growth. How many times do we think that we are causing the growth of a church or whatever? No. God can use them, but you and I are simply servants. God causes the growth. And it's important for us to keep it in mind, because oftentimes they can go to someone's head or whatever it might be. So that was the roles. You remember the second part he looked at was that of rewards. And notice it says you're rewarded according to your labor. And the reason I bring that up is in our country, in most of the jobs you've had, you're probably rewarded according to what? Labor or results? Results. And I think it's important to recognize you're rewarded according, because if you're serving Christ, does it mean the person you're serving or doing things is going to respond correctly? With Jeremiah, how well did they respond to his message? So I think it's important. We so often judge based on results. God's judging according to our labor and how we're doing it. And so I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. It reminds me, I've told you before, 50-some years ago, I was in a missions conference, and I met a missionary, and they had a panel up front, and they're asking questions. And part of it has to do with, like 4 different mission couples or 5, or whatever. and the church supported them, and they brought them in. They were in the States, and they were then had a panel, and people in the audience were asking questions. And part of it, they're under a lot of pressure because as a church, how much money do you have, and who are you going to support, who are you going to give money to? And the question came up is, how many people have you led to Christ over the last X amount of years? And they'd gone down, and some of them had, they got to one individual, and he and his wife were working in a Muslim country. And he started crying, and he said, maybe one. So what happens then, how many people think we shouldn't support him? Is he laboring? Is he laboring faithful? God sees it. And also, so I think it's important for us, we look at results, but God's looking at the labor. That was on the rewards. Notice it said also build on the proper foundation. How many times we need to be building on Christ? Can we build it on our own foundation for our own glory? And we can. We need to make sure we're building on Christ, and we're building it with His message, and we're building it the way He says to. It also then talks about the purity. What's your motive? That talks about being judged wood, hay, and stubble, or gold, and so on. Am I doing it for my glory, or am I doing it for God's glory? And just one part on it, because I think so often we think that it only applies to ministers or whoever it might be. Think about it in Matthew chapter 6, when He says, when you give, how should you give? Don't be like the Pharisees, and doing it to be seen, but give it in secret, right? And then you will be rewarded. You go, that's in verse 4. In verse 6, when you pray, don't pray to be seen among men, but pray closet, and God will reward you. When you fast, don't be fasting to, all gloomy, doomy outside, everybody sees you, but do it to then God will reward you. So your public life and your private life, God can reward you for. And does. All of us. It's also interesting, you think about your spiritual life, He does too, chapter 3. Right here He's talking about in verse 6, you're rewarded spiritually. But what about your, and I don't like the term because I don't think it's biblical. I don't think it's biblical to say spiritual life and secular life. It's life. You think about it in Colossians chapter 3, if you want to go that route, what does He say? Do you work heartily as unto the Lord? And then when you get to verse 24, and He says, and He will reward you. You mean when you're out there working wherever it may be on a car, or you're working at the refinery like I do, whatever it might be, your work is under the Lord, you can be rewarded. So every area of our life, private, public, whatever it might be, we are going to be evaluated for and rewarded for. So you have roles, you have rewards. Then you have the reminder, which he talked about last week in verse 16, and then we'll get to today's message. Notice he says, do you not know you are a temple of God? Now, I don't know if he mentioned it last week. The word there, you, is plural, and temple is singular. Who is he speaking to then? So it'd be, you all are temple singular. So in chapter 3, the temple is the university, is the church, local church combined. When he gets to chapter 6, he then talks about temple as an individual. So how can you have divisions among yourself if all of us are to be a temple of God group as a function together? So he's wanting to remind you of, hey, we are a temple of God, and we're all of us as a crew. Also the reminder, notice he gets down in the end when he says you belong to Christ. They were saying, I belong one, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of this. Whether you're following an order, following a person. He says, no, none of you belong or are part of me or whatever. We all belong to Christ. And so I think it's important to look at. So that's kind of the reminders that you have. Today we're going to be in chapter 4, verse 1 to 5. If you wanted a title for the message today, it would be The Measure of a Man or a Woman of God. Gene Getz, some of you might have read his book. It's been out for a long, long time. And he has two books, one entitled The Measure of a Man and one entitled The Measure of a Woman, in which he goes to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, or excuse me, 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. It goes to the qualifications and for a leader, a male leader, and then a female, and so on, and does a good job. But in this chapter, I think he also is going to tell him, how do you evaluate somebody? Paul says, okay, remember, they're wanting to judge Paul, and he's wanting to say, okay, you want to judge me? Okay, I'll tell you. This is how you judge me. And so Paul's going to say, okay, if you're going to judge me, let's do it rightly. Let's do it correctly. And I think it's time for another battery, even though it's not even 20 minutes old. One thing about it, when I do this, none of you are falling asleep. I hadn't heard any snoring today. Let's see if that does any better. Okay. Notice that I think it's important, because I think what reason I think it's good today too is how many of us in our country today are we judging historical figures and judging them in light of today's standards and not necessarily in light of what we should be judging by. And I think it's important for us to, so how do we evaluate? Paul's wanting to say, okay, you want to evaluate me? This is how you need to. So think about it and apply it to ourselves. First of all, the description. Notice the description, what he says. Let a man regard us. Now the word us, if you go back to verse 22, he's talking about Paul, Apollos, and Cephas, or Peter. Okay, if you want to regard us in this manner as servants, that's his desire. Let me ask you, how many of you want me to, if I, evaluating says, hey, I want you to judge me as a servant? How many of you are getting in line? That's an amazing statement. Paul's saying, hey, you want to evaluate me? Okay, this is what. He wants you to evaluate me as a servant and as a steward. Now, how many of us, when we're treated as a servant, get upset? But remember, a servant of who? So, I think it's interesting when he uses... Tell you what, glad it didn't happen in the hospital. I might have got out of bed. I don't know. Notice, though, I think it's important. What's the desire? But notice the description. The word there for servant is the word for under oarsman. Now, under oarsmen, if you know the much about the ships of those days, under oarsmen were in the hull of the ship, and oars stuck through the side, and they never even got up above. They're down there doing their work, but who even noticed it? But you had to have them doing the work for the, if you didn't have air movement or whatever in order for that ship to move. So I think it's important. Paul says, yeah, you want to look at me. Don't look at my oratory or my ability to speak. Look and see, am I a servant of Jesus Christ? And notice I noticed the distinction was of Christ. Not a servant of myself. Not a servant of this, but a servant of Jesus. How many of us really are saying, that's my desire. I want to be a servant of Christ. In Mark chapter 10, you remember, he says, when they had this debate about the sons of Zebedee, who's the greatest? And he says the greatest is he who serves. And then in verse 45, the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. In Luke 6 and verse 40, a pupil is not above his teacher, but when he is fully trained to be like his teacher. Okay, so if you want to be like Christ is a servant, then you need to be a servant. It's interesting if you ever look in Luke chapter 1, when Luke is writing in verse 2, and it says he gathered the information from all the eyewitnesses who were, quote, servants. Luke saw Peter and all the other apostles as servants, and he even uses that word. So notice the first thing I think it's interesting when you look at it, his first description was that of a servant. And the question I can ask you, how do you want to be evaluated by others? Do I want people to look at me and say, that's the servant of Christ? Or do, hey, seriously, Paul is saying, I want to be, people see me as a servant. It's kind of humorous in one aspect. I understand I know of a young couple that is overseas, and they got his doctorate degree, and he's working in one place, and visa was up, so he went to England, and because of this COVID deal, he and his wife were hired by a very wealthy group, a very wealthy family, to teach their two kids, because they can't go to school and things like that. So they were teaching them, doing fine, and then the two young people, I'm guessing they're teenagers, I don't know their age, when the young couple came in and the kids had friends or whatever over, said, oh, here, I want to introduce you, these are my servants. Now, how well do you think that goes over? If you have a doctorate degree and you're called somebody's servant. Well, how well do we want to be called if we're called a servant of Jesus Christ? And so I think it's important for us to recognize where are we and what do we want to be called. Notice the second thing on the description. Notice he says that of a steward. That's his desire. How many of you want to be a steward? If you're a steward, it means you're managing what? Somebody else's estate. How many of you want to manage somebody else's estate, or how many of you want to own and manage your own estate? There is a big difference. And I think it's important. Notice his description that you have there with steward was that, like I said, taking care of it. And notice it's a steward of Christ's things. How many of us recognize everything we have is Christ? I think it's important for us to recognize it's not mine. He's given it to me to manage. And you look at it in Luke 19, you have one of the minas, if you remember, and each one is given the same amount, because all of us have how many hours in a day? 24/7. So that's what I've had to be evaluated even when I've been in the hospital and so on. Okay, am I taking the 24/7 he's given me? Am I using my gifts the way he should, or am I doing things that's taken away from me from doing what he wants me to do? And that's for every one of you. And our conscience can easily get involved in different things. So every one of us has to evaluate what may be right for me yesterday may not be right for me today. What does he want me to do? And so I think it's an interesting distinction, but you have that, the same thing with the talents. You remember in the talents in Matthew 25, he gives it to them at different amounts because they have different abilities, and he judges accordingly. You and I want to judge each other based on one's better than the other, more ability. God judges how faithful you are with what he gave you. And I think it's important. It's a question you can ask yourself, what has he entrusted you with, and what are you doing with it? Obviously, he didn't take me home. He could have last weekend. So he has something for me to do. So what's he entrusted me with, and what am I doing with it? Okay, so that's the first one you have, that a description of a servant and a steward. But what about the duty in verse 2? In this case, moreover, it's required of a steward that one be found trustworthy or faithful. I think it's the requirement. Now, a lot of these, I think we mess up on this part. So look over in 1 Peter. It's a requirement, but I want to give you a couple of reminders. Look over in 1 Peter, if you would, in chapter 4. Before I read it, let me ask you a question. How many of you have a spiritual gift? All of us? Okay. Let's read verse 10. As each one has received a spiritual gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards. Paul is a steward of the mysteries of God, what God has given him, the revelations, Peter, what God had given him when he was Mount of Transfiguration and the rest of it. But he has given you and I spiritual gifts. And Paul says, I am a steward. I have to be responsible for what he's given me. Each and every single one of us is a steward of the gift he has given us. And if we're not doing it, what's going to happen when we stand before him one day? I'm being serious. Every single one of us is a steward. He has entrusted every single one of us. What happens is we like to look at other people and see how well they're doing. It's a personal evaluation. It's also, if you remember in 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 7, he makes the statement that we need to use your spiritual gift for the common good. Can we use our gifts for our own good? Very much so. You can use it for all kinds of things for our own good. We're supposed to do it for the common good. And so I think it's important for us. So you think about that. You have your duty that you have. And then look over in 1 Corinthians 9, since we're talking about this duty of being faithful. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Notice in verse 17, it talks about Paul and he's preaching. For I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. Do you think every time when he's getting beaten and everything else that he says, oh boy, let me jump up, I want to go do it again? There are times when you're not going to want to, but you're given a stewardship, a responsibility, and that's what you have to do. Notice what he says, though, if I'm only doing it out of obligation, The reward is not there, but it's what I have to do. But when I do it because I want to do it, reward is available. I mean, just like tomorrow morning, I'm looking so excited about going and putting that Nomex on and going back to the refinery. Not. Okay? Okay? But you go for a paycheck. But what are we doing the same thing with our spiritual gifts? Do we do it because I feel obligated, or do I do it because I want to serve my Lord? It's an important one. So I think about it, just on the duty part, we've had this description. The duty is God's steward. How faithful have you been with what He's given you? What are your gifts or talents, and whom do you serve? I think a lot of times we take what we have to serve ourselves. And a lot of people may not know what it is. We're hoping to come across that later in the book to kind of maybe help. But a lot of people are using their abilities or gifts but don't know what it is, but others around it see it. Give you an example. When people are down, they don't usually call me because I don't have the gift of mercy. But they call Gene. So whether a lot of times what happens then, people can see your gift, you may not see it, but others can. So I think it's important to serve where you're at, and it'll come natural to you when you do it. Notice the next thing. What about a detour? Can any of us ever get off on a detour? You don't drive very far in Oklahoma without being on a detour of some sort. Notice in the first detour that you have, I think is interesting, that you have in chapter 4 and verse 3. But to me, it is a very small thing that I should be examined by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even examine myself. How many of us get caught up in being examined by a human court? How many of us care so much about other people's opinions? In fact, I would be fair and honest. I think most of us say we care more about human opinion than about anybody else's opinion. Any of you ever fallen asleep at church and your Bible fell out of your hand, hit the floor? What's your first reaction?
Look around, see who's watching.
Why do we care if they're watching or not? Any of you, what we could have, maybe a better response would be what? Lord, I stayed up and watched that double feature movie last night, and I'm a little tired today, and I messed up. That's all that matters. Or you did everything you can, like I've done before, and I've had to work all night, and you go to church the next day, and you're doing your best, and you're just flat exhausted, and Lord knows, and other people, they don't have any business judging you for falling asleep because you've been up for 24 hours. But it's interesting. Look over in Galatians 1 to fit along this human court, because I think it's really important for us to look at this. It's been a verse that's been on my mind for the last couple of years. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10. It makes the statement, am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still striving to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. So was Paul originally trying to please men? But now he is not. Philippians 4, remember, he was not content, but now that he is. Who are we trying to please? If it's in human courts, we're in trouble. We're not, because they are, people's opinions change all the time, do they not? And who do you talk to? I mean, you look at, in our country today, how much of the opinions have changed. What does God say? Not what does everybody else say. And I think it's going to get to a place where we are going to definitely be in the minority. But what does God do? So I think it's interesting, the duty, and you have the detour. One was human, but you notice also, when you get into chapter 4, back in 1 Corinthians 4, notice what about verse 4? 1 Corinthians 4:4, it makes this statement, I am conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. So you have the human court, others around, but we also have the personal court. And I think we have to be careful even in the human court, our personal court. The reason for it, if you think about it, Acts 23 and verse 1, Paul, when he's standing before the being judged, he said, I have a clear conscience all the way up from the past all the way up until today. Okay? How many of us can go and say we have a clear conscience about everything? Just because I have a clear conscience doesn't mean that I haven't messed up. Can I manipulate my conscience? Okay? Can I think what I'm doing is right when in actuality it may not be? How many of you have ever read the book Peace Child? You ever read it? It's a missionary who went down to a missionary couple who went and they were serving among a tribe, and the tribe, their greatest virtue in the tribe was deception. So when they were trying to speak about Christ, when they got into Genesis and stuff and talked about Satan, they were clapping, they thought Satan, that's the one. That's who they identified as the deception. For them, for their conscience, they had no conscience whatsoever about being deceiving. That's how they were raised, and they thought it was just fine. I talked to one a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about with what's going on in our country, and he said, well, it's okay to burn down somebody's buildings and burn some cars, different things. We need change. Therefore, the ends does what? Justifies the mean. So that's another one you have in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 20. You can have too strict a conscience, but you can have too lenient of a conscience. But before we get on other people, how many of us have done it in our own life? You don't know what he's done to me. You don't know what this is. You don't know what that is. And we are too lenient in our own conscience. Or we can be too strict. We think God has forgiven me, but I can't do anything for him because of how bad I am. And so I think it's important to recognize our human conscience. We need to be aware of it and so on, but it's not the ultimate judge. You have the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2. It says that some people have even seared their conscience. You know of anybody that seems like they can go do anything and it doesn't bother them at all? Whether it's injury, stealing, whatever it might be, they have no conscience. But even among believers, we sometimes can sear certain parts of our conscience as well. So you think about it, you have this deal that we have human courts and then the personal, but how many of us are judging people before we know all the facts? Have any of you ever judged somebody or said something before you got all the facts? How many of you ever had to put a size 12 shoe in your mouth a few times, you know, when you know it? And you can go ask for forgiveness, but the damage is still there. The damage is still there. And I think it's interesting when you have that. So here you have a detour. Notice the final one is that of destiny. Notice in chapter 4 and verse 5, therefore do not go on passing judgment. It's in the present command, so in other words, he's telling you, the Corinthians, stop doing this. You are judging and you need to stop doing it. What do you and I? Is it not the same thing to stop judging? Okay, notice the next thing he says, stop judging before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things hidden in darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. Okay, you know, there's a lot of good deeds that people do that are in darkness that nobody else knows about. And so we can judge people and we don't even know what all they're doing. A lot of good things. And so that's going to come to light so we can falsely judge. But then there could be things that they're doing that are good, but they're doing it for their own benefit, and that's going to show, and that's going to be what? The wrong motive. And so you and I can come to the wrong conclusions, good or bad, but God will not, because he knows all these things. So let him judge, and he will. He'll bring it all to light. Why they did things. How many of you, when you were, I know you have to go back a few years for some of us, along with that. How many of you remember when you were in the youth group, if you were in a local church? How many of you went to the youth group because there was somebody of the opposite sex who was going to be there, so you went for the wrong reason? And you went every week. But everybody thought, what about you? Look at that teenager, they're in church, they're doing this. And you are what? You know, if the opposite sex hadn't been there, you wouldn't have been there either. We can easily misjudge a person's motives, but God does. It's also interesting, he says, then praise will come from him. How many of us are willing to wait for his praise? How many of us want praise so bad that we will bypass to get praise of men today rather than the praise of him in the future? It's like I told you the one before. Remember the missionary that I told you about that came back from England, he and his wife? They came back, they were elderly, and they were coming back off the field, they're retiring. They were going home. And they're on a ship, And there was people all over with banners and cheers and a band playing, and they were so excited. They're getting ready to get off, and they thought people were walking them home. And of course, they were in, what we would call second class or whatever. By the time they get there, the band and everybody's gone. And the husband was really discouraged because they found out there was a dignitary that was coming back on that ship. And they were there and they welcomed him in and they left. And then the wife turned to the husband and said, "We haven't got home yet." And I think that's important. We're not home yet. But I always want the praise of men. So let's think about it today, just the applications. When you think about the measure of a man or a measure of a woman of God, how do I want to be evaluated or recognized? Do I want to be recognized as a servant and a steward? What has Christ entrusted to me, and what am I doing with it? Why do I ask you to ask these questions? Are you going to be asked these questions later? Isn't it best to be asked them now so you can address them the way He wants you to address them so He doesn't have to do it later? As God's servant and steward, how faithful have you been, and whom do you serve? You can take your gifts, but it doesn't mean you're serving Him. Do I desire the applause of men or future praise of Christ? And then the one we've often talked about, am I living for the line or am I living for what? The eternity or today?